Hello, welcome to Jazz Is.
Jazz Is
MasterClass series
at the National Jazz Museum.
At the National Jazz Museum in Harlem.
I am Sekou McMillan, the curator of special projects.
My name is Albert Marquez, Zach O'Farrell.
My name is Shirazette Titten.
And we are in conversation with the legendary Bertha Hope. Jazz could only have happened here in America.
The key to everything was the radio.
So this world is too dense. 15 minutes isn't enough to cover it all.
Are you ready? I am.
Years of 1919 and 1923 were tumultuous. They were a shakeup. At that time, the post-World War I era was a period where no one really knew what was going to happen next. This is Jazz Is, a masterclass at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, and my name's Matthew Rivera. I'm an archivist, researcher, and historian, and I do a radio show at WKCR. Today I'm going to be covering jazz in Harlem from around the 19-teens to the 1940s. That'll be broken down into 4 parts. Part 1 is going to be about the rise of jazz and the rise of Harlem going from around 1910 to 1923. Then we'll go into the Jazz Age, 1924 to 1930. Followed by the Swing Revolution, 1931 to 1938. And finally, the birth of bebop, 1939 to 1946. So for part 1, the rise of jazz and the rise of Harlem, it's important to go back to a period before jazz and Harlem meant what it means today. And we don't have to go that far back. In 1910, jazz was virtually an unknown word and it was not applied to music. And Harlem was not the center of Black New York. At that time, Juan Hill, the area around present-day Lincoln Center, was the predominantly Black neighborhood in New York City. Now, Juan Hill in the 19-teens was home to residencies, to Black businesses, bars, hotels, and it was the center of the entire entertainment world of Black New York. In the period of Juan Hill, ragtime was the popular music of the day. And a number of great musicians came up in Juan Hill who were predominant ragtime musicians. And Juan Hill was the center of the Great Migration in the earliest stages, which we consider to be the 19-teens, 1920s. But the Great Migration had its first wave in New York City going from about 1890 to 1910, a period where the Black population in New York City actually tripled. Now, this is really important because ragtime is the product of Black creativity. It's the product of the South. And it's a music that had to migrate to become popular culture. Now, let's think for a second about what exactly ragtime was and its similarities and repercussions in this early phase of the Great Migration. The product of the Great Migration was a result of, number one, the Industrial Revolution. And ragtime was a product of the industrialization of the music industry. Pianos being mass-produced, music printing being a commonplace, middle-class kind of home entertainment product. Owning a piano in this time, the late 1800s, turn of the century, was like owning a television. Every middle-class family had one. And ragtime was also the product of a Jim Crow South. In the botched Reconstruction starting in the 1870s with the exodus of Union troops from the South, the tragedy of Reconstruction was really a disenfranchisement that began to take place under this clause of separate but equal. The result, of course, the 1896 decision of Plessy versus Ferguson meant that the South was no longer a feasible place for Black people to feel safe, and the North offered economic opportunity as well as the possibility of a better life. So that population tripling during that period of 1890 to 1910 was no coincidence at all. And ragtime, as part of the music and its rise in that same period, was in many ways the soundtrack to the political landscape of that moment. There are a lot of different reasons that historians give for the neighborhood being named San Juan Hill. But one of them, and the one that I personally believe the most, is that San Juan Hill, as we know, was a battle in the Spanish-American War. And of course, if you know what present-day Lincoln Center in that area of the West 60s is like, it's hilly. It's a neighborhood that's on a hill. But also, in those days, San Juan Hill was a rough neighborhood. This was a period where there was quickly overcrowding and all of the same problems that were happening in Black communities around the country at this turn of the century phase. High costs of living, low income, and as a result, violence. And the neighborhood of San Juan Hill was not the best place for people to live in those early years of the 1900s. In 1900 itself, there was a revolt in San Juan Hill and a huge amount of violence that occurred between the police and the residents of San Juan Hill. And it was the dawn of people looking for a new place to go. The fact that Harlem ended up being the place, and again, I should point out, it was not inevitable that Harlem would be the home of those Black Southerners coming in this early wave of the Great Migration, but it was inevitable that they would need to go somewhere, and that San Juan Hill was not going to continue to be the place because it was already overcrowded. That it was Harlem was in many ways a real estate fluke and a miraculous one. Let's think for a second about what Harlem was around the turn of the century. Harlem was a upper middle class white borough in the north of Central Park in this time. Harlem was a neighborhood that was kind of like in the countryside of Manhattan at that period. It was an up-and-coming neighborhood. Its main thoroughfare was 125th Street, lined with theaters and businesses. But it was not by any means a neighborhood that people living there, and at the turn of the century, it was not a neighborhood where people living at the turn of the century would have expected a rise of a Black population. Now, the reason that happened was because of speculative real estate at the beginning of the 20th century. And as a result, a lot of luxury houses were built in Harlem, but it crashed. And these houses were left empty. And the Black community had a place to go in that now there were Black real estate companies starting in 1904 that began to lease apartments out to Black tenants, many of whom were coming from the South. And when we think about the migration, we should also consider that there were two patterns of migration from the South. There was the pattern of migration that was coming from the Delta region, usually up to Chicago, Louisiana, Mississippi. And the Southerners that were coming to New York were usually from Georgia, the Carolinas. That is an important difference in what made the migration to New York City so specific. Now, in many ways, no one better represents the early music scene of Harlem than James Reese Europe. James Reese Europe was the leader of a orchestra called the Clef Club Orchestra, and later the Harlem Hellfighters. He was born in Alabama, but raised in Washington, D.C., which In 1900, actually had the largest Black population of any city in America. New York City would surpass that in 1920, but in 1910, Washington, D.C. was still number one. Now, James Reese Europe came to New York at a time when the predominant union of musicians was completely segregated, barred to anyone who was not white. It was not at that time the union that it would be later, but the problem led to the rise of the New Amsterdam Musicians Association. In 1904, this organization was the first union for Black musicians in New York City. James Reese Europe found himself in New York around 1903 playing in the saloons around the San Juan Hill area. But he was a classically trained violinist. In fact, he had received music lessons from Frederick Douglass's grandson and one of the members of John Philip Sousa's marching band. So James Reese Europe had a really strong musical background. And if you know much about Washington, D.C.'s Black history, you know that this was a community that was very, very proud. Duke Ellington came out of that community. Now, James Reese Europe arrived, the New York that James Reese Europe arrived in could not have been any more different from the world that he was used to. San Juan Hill, as we've already said, was San Juan Hill. But the situation with the union and the New Amsterdam Musicians Association offered a sense of hope for musicians who were struggling to find professional working status. Most musicians were either touring, traveling musicians, or they were anything but established professionals. James Reese Europe really tried to change that with his own organization called the Clef Club. It was a social fraternity, it was a union for Black musicians, and it was based in Harlem. Now, the Clef Club, which started around 1910, had its own concert at Carnegie Hall in 1912. The Clef Club Orchestra recorded in 1913. And James Reese Europe's popular band ultimately would go to Europe and serve as a military band during World War I. For a second, I should point out that in that band, there was a huge group of Puerto Rican musicians. And this is really important because these were some of the earliest Puerto Rican musicians to come to Harlem and play music with these early jazz pioneers who at the time aren't playing a music even known as jazz. Now, James Reese Europe, as his fame grew, unfortunately died in 1919 when one of his own musicians murdered him. It was at a concert in Boston. And it was a tragedy by all accounts. James Reese Europe's career, however, left a lasting impact on the professional status of musicians in New York City. Those years of 1919 and 1923 were tumultuous. They were a shakeup. At that time, the post-World War I era was a period where no one really knew what was going to happen next. The main union in New York was at odds within itself because there was a ban on strikes during World War I, and that lasted after the war too. And in 1921, when the musicians did go on strike, the whole thing collapsed and a new union was founded, Local 802. They needed members. And so suddenly, for the first time, Black musicians could become members of the main union. And New York City had one of the only integrated unions in the United States going all the way up into the mid-20th century. So that period of the early teens, or of the early 1920s, late teens, coincided with a new recording craze for a music that was coming up, and it was the blues. The blues had its first publications in the teens, and the important thing about the blues, I think, is that it is a music that falls into every genre of popular music around it. So in the period of the early 1920s, for the first time, Black musicians began to record the blues. And that happened because OK Records took Perry Bradford, who was a song plugger, an Afro-American who was prominent in the Tin Pan Alley world. He was a Harlemite himself, up on his offer to record a singer named Mamie Smith. And in 1920, she made Crazy Blues, and it began a blues craze. It began a craze of recording blues that was so strong that a whole market of recording for this new population of Black Southerners migrating from the South, which is only increasing, by the way, during the 19-teens, to buy these records of Black blues artists. And the records were called race records by the companies that were making them. OK Records, Columbia soon followed suit, and even Victor Records, the biggest of the day, was putting out records of Black blues artists. These records were beginning to compete with pianos as home entertainment at that time. But the label of race records and the whole concept was seen with a great deal of skepticism by the leaders of the Black community. And that's going to lead us into Black Swan Records. Black Swan Records was Harlem's record label. It was the first major Black-owned record label and the biggest Black-owned record label up to the 1950s. No experiment like it had existed before or would exist until the 1950s. Black Swan Records epitomized the optimism and the opportunity of those early years of Harlem. It was founded in 1921 by Harry Pace, who was a former partner of W.C. Handy, the father of the blues, a composer of the St. Louis Blues and so many others. And Black Swan Records was proud that it was Black-owned and that it recorded Black artists. Not only blues and jazz and ragtime and even a little bit of West Indian calypso music, but Black classical artists as well. So Black Swan Records was successful in those early months, really. In its inception, 1921, it had a big hit with Ethel Waters and Fletcher Henderson, a pianist from Atlanta who was a huge figure in the history of jazz in Harlem, would be its music director. But unfortunately, the label was short-lived. It basically did itself in when they began to lease masters by white artists. And the way I see it, Black Swan kind of sold itself out for a number of reasons. The label needed to make more pressings and needed to compete with this rise of industry in the early 1920s. And it just grew in a way too fast, too soon. But the label in its own story would have lasting repercussions on the music world that jazz and Harlem were both a part of in the early 1920s. And while I'm on that point, let's talk about jazz itself for a second. The term jazz, as we started in this presentation saying, was not really a thing in 1910, but by 1915, jazz is a label that's put onto this new music that's touring through vaudeville. A music that comes from New Orleans. It's a style of ragtime in many ways, but it's also absolutely its own thing. Jazz is a music that has the syncopation of ragtime. And when we talk about ragtime, it's really important that you know syncopation is the key to the whole music. But jazz has this extra component of lengthy improvisation around a melody. Jazz has a specific kind of rhythm and a specific style of syncopation. And in 1917, when the first jazz recordings were made by the original Dixieland Jazz Band, though there have been some earlier recordings by Wilbur Sweatman, and even James Reese Europe's 1913 recording should be mentioned. But really, the ODJB's recordings in 1917 were the big hit of jazz that put the music on the map as a recording art. The music began to take place as New York's popular music in this time, and it found its way into the venues of Juan Hill by way of New York's main contribution to this new sound of jazz, and that's stride piano. James P. Johnson, who was the father of stride piano, began playing in Juan Hill, and when folks from the Carolinas wanted him to play breakdown numbers, he started to play a new style. That style of stride piano and James P. Johnson's music was New York's contribution to jazz. And it's the music that would be the soundtrack of Harlem.